Welcome to this session of webinar. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Mr. Prashant Bhushan, who is an eminent lawyer and everybody knows about him. So obviously he needs no introduction. But then since this session we have decided to have on a topic wherein he is already very, very active. So let me tell you something about him. He is basically a public interest lawyer, and he is unlike all lawyers. I mean, wherein others might be doing it as a practice, but he does it more for the social welfare, more on the issues which affect the entire society, which affect the entire country. And in so many public interest litigations, he has appeared in the court. Either he himself is filing certain PILs, and I believe everybody must be aware of PILs because this is one instrument with which the government can be compelled to do certain things which the government is otherwise overlooking or neglecting. And then these days, since this whole issue of the migrant labor for the last 2 months, the way this whole issue has affected the country has jolted the whole conscious of the country. But then there are people, there are policymakers, there are rulers and governors who do not pay much heed to the plight of the migrant labor. And that is how we decided to have this discussion with Mr. Prashant Bhushan. So today's discussion is focused on the legal rights of migrant labor, because migrant labor is a major workforce in the country, and they belong to the informal sector, but then they are the backbone of our economy. uh, be it manufacturing or I mean any other sector or in the service sector, everywhere you will find these migrant laborers. In fact, the kind of development model in India that we adopted after independence and then the way we have been proceeding for the last 20 years, this has in fact increased this problem. We all are aware about this, and but then during the normal times nobody took notice that way to this whole issue of the migrant labor. But then since the lockdown was announced abruptly by the prime minister, and there was no time not only to the migrant laborers but to other people also, there was no time to settle down or to return to their places or wherever somebody was there. There was no time to make sure that for the next 20 days or 30 days or 40 days, everything will be in place and the people will not be in trouble. And that is how this kind of problem arose. In fact, politically speaking, this is one such problem which is used for the vote bank, but then their problems are not looked into, and this COVID-19 has in fact aggravated this problem. So coming back to this whole problem, to whole issue, I once again come to this. So whatever was done by the government for the last 2 months for the migrant laborers, this problem could not be solved by the government, despite the fact a lot of NGOs came forward, voluntary organizations came forward, and they tried to do best to the help of the migrant labor. But obviously, without the state intervention, nothing was possible. And this was noticed in the first lockdown, and then again in the second lockdown this continued, but then it was not covered by the media the way it should have been covered. Nobody took notice that this whole movement of the migrant labor was happening. In the third lockdown or towards the end of the third lockdown and the fourth lockdown, this problem again surfaced, and then the media also woke up, and almost every channel started showing a story on this. So government came into under pressure, but still a lot not lot was done for this. And in any such situation, the role of the judiciary comes. But then judiciary, I mean the apex court, the Supreme Court also did not act on its own. And in the PILs also nothing much has happened. And in one of such PILs which has been filed by Mr. Jagdeep Chokar, Mr. Prashant Bhushan is appearing before a 3-judge bench of the Supreme Court. So there can be no better person than Prashant Bhushan ji to talk on this issue. He is the most credible and the genuine face, the expert who can speak on this. So I will initially request Mr. Prashant Bhushan to to throw light on all relevant aspect of this whole issue of the migrant labor during COVID-19 pandemic. And thereafter, I will be having, I have certain queries, so I will be raising those points and I will request him to answer to that. And then obviously there are questions from the participants of this session. So those questions are also welcome, and then we will be taking up those questions. So I once again welcome Mr. Prashant Bhushan, and I request please start with your expression.
Good evening. Thank you very much for that introduction, for that kind introduction. So as you all know, migrant workers are a class of workers who have migrated from one state to another in order to work, do any kind of work. But because they are workers as well, therefore they have workmen as well. Therefore they have their normal rights as any other workman under the Industrial Disputes Act, Payment of Wages Act, Contract Labor Abolition and Regulation Act, etc. But there is also a special law dealing with migrant workers. It's called the Migrant Workers Act of 1979, Interstate Migrant Workers Act of 1979. Which requires that all these migrant workers must be registered by the district and the state authorities and the national authority. And therefore, even the contractors who employ them should be registered. The employers or the companies which employ them should be registered, and they should have a complete list as well as information on all these migrant workers who are working interstate, who have migrated from their state to work in another state. The Act also provides for regulation of their conditions of work, for their residential accommodation, toilets, canteens, etc., that need to be provided to them, for the leave that needs to be given to them, for some travel allowance to go back home once a year that needs to be given by the employer, and for payment of minimum wages. Because it was found that this class of workers, that is migrant workers, were being severely exploited, just as contract workers were being exploited. And that's why we had the Contract Labor Abolition and Regulation Act, which says that you cannot employ contract labor in long-term jobs, and for that you must have regular workmen. We also have another act called the Building and Other Construction Workers Act of 1996. This act regulates the conditions and provides for the welfare of workers who are working in the construction industry. These are also mostly migrant workers. We find that a lot of the migrant workers are working in the construction industry. And this act provides for collection of funds from the companies which are involved in construction, which fund is to be used for the benefit of these construction workers, for their education, health, social security, etc. And we have found that over the last several years since this act has been in operation, an amount of more than 35,000 crores has been collected by way of this fund under this act, and a lot of it was not disbursed or used for the benefit of the workers. So about 2 years ago in 2018, the Supreme Court issued a very important gave a very important judgment in which they said that all the authorities must firstly register all these construction workers, because they found that there were about 4 crore construction workers in the country and only 1.5 crores were registered. In fact, under the Interstate Migrant Workers Act also, I feel, according to the Government of India's census, there of 2011, there were more than 4 crore interstate migrant workers in the country, out of which I suspect, nobody has any accurate information of how many are registered, though the Act provides for compulsory registration. But my suspicion is that not even 1 crore out of those would have been registered, because these acts, both the Interstate Migrant Workers Act as well as the Building and Construction Workers Act of 1996, these two acts are hardly being implemented in this country. Now, this is so far as the normal law for migrant workers is concerned. Now, the problem arose in the context of this lockdown in response to this coronavirus. I mean, a very much more serious problem arose with regard to these migrant workers. And the problem was a twofold problem. The first problem was that because of the lockdown, the migrant workers were deprived of any work, because obviously they couldn't work during the lockdown. They are mostly daily wagers who get daily wages. Some of them may even get monthly wages. But as soon as their work stops, they stop getting paid. This was one problem. And because they stopped getting money, obviously they couldn't even pay the rent of wherever they were staying. They couldn't even get food for themselves. They couldn't send any money back to their families, because normally they send money back to their families for their families to survive. So this was the first problem, that they were deprived of wages and thereby deprived of uh, all the various things that they need for living. The second problem was that in this situation, most of them wanted to go back home to their villages, because at least in the villages they would be with their families, they would have something to eat. Something to eat at least there in the villages. Most of them would have some land, or they would be able to get something to eat there, even in the absence of having any wages, etc. And therefore, in any case, they wanted to be with their families during this situation, and they wanted to go back. And a large number of them just uh, tried to go back despite the lockdown. They came out in the thousands, or even sometimes in the tens of thousands, to railway stations, to bus stations. And when they found that there was no transport available or able to take them there, thereafter they started walking back. Literally, lakhs of people started walking back. Whoever had bicycles, they started bicycling back. Whoever had rickshaws, they started uh, using the rickshaws to go back, some of them thousands of kilometers away to their original homes, mainly to UP and Bihar. And at that stage, the government of India issued an order that no, they must not be allowed to go back. They must all be caught and put in these shelter homes. Now, these shelter homes obviously got very crowded. Many of them were beaten up. FIRs were registered against them. They were put in these shelter homes, which became very crowded, which meant that they would become a hotbed for spreading this coronavirus. The conditions of these shelter homes were also not very good. Uh, though food was supposed to be provided to them in these shelter homes, but in most places we found that just one meal was being provided, and that too a very poor quality meal, usually uncooked meal, etc. So two petitions were filed by us in the Supreme Court. One was filed by Harsh Mandar and Anjali Bharadwaj, seeking payment of wages to them. By this time, the government of India had also, or soon after the filing of this petition, the government of India issued a notification saying that, number one, that all the employers of these migrant workers should pay their wages during the lockdown. Number two, that their landlords should not seek rent from them during the lockdown. Number three, that Acha, koi nahi. Sorry. What happened? Sorry. It's okay. Don't worry. So I think I have enough battery. Actually, there was a battery problem. Sorry, there was a battery problem in my phone. So, so I was saying that two petitions were filed, one by Harsh Mandar and Anjali Bharadwaj, saying that they should be paid at least minimum wages during this period of lockdown by the government of India. Though the government of India had issued this order that they should be paid their wages by their employers and the landlord should not charge them rent, but we found that that order was not being implemented. It was not capable of being implemented because most of these employers were also running in losses during the lockdown. They had no work, they had no business. Only a few employers were in a position to pay their wages, and landlords, etc., were not ready to implement that order. Most of the landlords were also very small people. They were mostly living in these jhuggies, etc., that were rented out to them. So, therefore, and a lot of these people were self-employed people who didn't have any employer. So therefore, there was no way that they could be paid any wages during this time. So therefore, many of them were rickshaw pullers, some of them were street vendors, etc. So we said that since the government has imposed this lockdown, and in any case, it is the obligation of the government to provide for Article 21 rights of these people, because Article 21 requires that everybody has a right to live a life of dignity and have at least the minimum things which are necessary for them to lead a life of dignity, which included at least getting minimum wages so that they could have access to some food, some education for their children, some health care, etc. So one was that they should be provided wages. And the second petition was filed after some time by Jagdeep Chokar when it was found that the government was stopping them and not allowing them to migrate, that the government should allow them to go back to their homes and the government should provide them with some transport or some facility which allows them to go back to their homes. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court did not pay much heed to this issue of neither of wages nor of their migration back to their homes. And after one or two hearings and taking the affidavit of the government, and the government said that no, everything is fine, they are all fine, they are all being taken care of, nobody is on the road, etc. They dismissed both these petitions. The Supreme Court dismissed both these petitions by saying that, well, government has said that they are taking care of everything and therefore uh, nothing needs to be done so far as these people are concerned. So unfortunately, that petition, those petitions came to be dismissed. Some other petitions had been filed by other people like Mahua Moitra or Swami Agnivesh or some other people also relating to these migrant workers, and those also came to be dismissed. Thereafter, a petition was filed after some of these people, migrants who were walking back home, they were killed because they were sleeping on the tracks and trains ran over them. Then a petition was filed saying that, well, they should not be walking back and some transport should be provided to them. Some vehicles or some other arrangement should be made. Some trains should be run for them. At that stage, also the Supreme Court did not intervene and said that, well, we can't prevent them from walking back. What can be done about this? And they dismissed that petition also. That led to a lot of public criticism of the Supreme Court. Because, see, both petitions were based on absolutely very clear fundamental rights. The right to get minimum wages during the lockdown is a absolute indefeasible Article 21 right of these people, because lockdown has prevented them from getting any wages or getting any work. They need those wages in order to survive. Survival is their fundamental right under Article 21. And since the government has done it, and in any case, it is the obligation of the government to ensure that they have the at least bare necessities for survival. Therefore, it was the obligation of the government to provide them with minimum wages. Same thing about their being permitted to travel back to their homes. After all, the UP government got some several thousand students who were studying in coaching institutes in Kota. They got them back to UP. The central government did not obstruct their movement because the UP government was headed by a member of the same party which heads the central government. Same thing about Gujarat. Gujarat got many of these pilgrims who were stuck in Haridwar and Rishikesh back to Gujarat by buses, etc. During this lockdown, again, the central government did not obstruct their travel, etc. So, how could they obstruct the travel of these migrant workers? It was a clear violation of Article 14. Similarly, Article 19 says that everybody has a right to move freely through the territory of India. You can only put reasonable restrictions on that. The Jagdeep Chokhar's petition said you test them for corona. If they are found to be negative, then you allow them to go back home. Now, you cannot say that no, we will not allow them to go back home. We will obstruct their Article 19 right to travel freely and go back home, even if they are corona negative. One can even understand that if they are corona positive, you don't want this disease to spread to their villages, etc., and therefore you prevent them. But how can you prevent them when they are negative and when they have been tested to be negative? So, and it was their Article 21 right as well, because here they were starving. They didn't have any place to stay also. At least in their villages, they would have a place to stay, and they needed to be with their families. Here they were on the streets because they had been checked out by the landlords for being unable to pay their rents. So therefore, both petitions were based on very, very clear violation of fundamental rights of these migrant workers. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court was just not bothered. They were happy to just accept whatever the government said to them, even if what the government said to them was so patently absurd that every newspaper report, every media report, every report was contradicting what the government said, but they still chose to believe whatever the government said. So after the dismissal of these petitions, there was very, very widespread criticism and very strident criticism of the Supreme Court by a large number of advocates, senior advocates, retired judges, other very senior political commentators and judicial commentators, etc., who said that the Supreme Court has virtually abandoned its responsibility to protect the fundamental rights and to enforce the fundamental rights of citizens and to enforce the constitution. That is, to make the government enforce their obligations under the constitution to protect the rights of these people. And the Supreme Court has just abandoned them. It is the responsibility. The Supreme Court and the high courts have been created for the purpose. Of course, one is to decide cases, but the second most important function of the high courts and the Supreme Court is to ensure that the executive and the legislature remain within the bounds has the responsibility to act in a manner which is enforcing the rights of the people, or to act in a manner to facilitate the exercise of rights of the people. And therefore, and that's the responsibility given to the High Courts and the Supreme Court. Supreme Court totally failed. High Courts, many High Courts at least started doing something. As many as 19 High Courts issued various directions to various state governments, central government, etc., railways, etc., about the migrant workers. But the Supreme Court spectacularly and singularly failed and collapsed. And that is why so much criticism. I mean, the Supreme Court has never had faced as much criticism as they faced in their handling of migrant workers. And then suddenly, being faced with so much criticism over a period of almost 1 month, after that, they suddenly woke up and issued suo motu notice on the issue of migrant workers, saying that, and then they issued a direction that they should be permitted to travel. And that case is still going on. Today, there was another hearing of that case in which they heard submissions and they have reserved some orders, but the case will continue for some time. So it's only in response to this criticism that they woke up. And there are many issues which are being discussed in this case. One is that whether, of course, now many of these migrant workers have in fact gone back home, have been able to go back home, maybe around 50% have, but 50% are still stranded. And now, unfortunately, the whole system of registration is such that there is online registration, which is in English, and many of these workers are illiterate, and therefore they cannot register online. Therefore, the government has no accurate information. No government has any accurate information of how many migrant workers are still stranded and want to go back. This is one problem. The second problem is that when they go back, they are put into forced these quarantine centers. In many states, they are forcing them to remain in quarantine centers for 2 weeks. And many of these quarantine centers are quite terrible. And even people who are totally asymptomatic, who have not been found to have this coronavirus, they are also being put in these quarantine centers. And in Bihar, the conditions of these quarantine centers were so bad that eventually they had to issue an order closing down all the quarantine centers and saying that, all right, all these migrant workers coming back can be permitted to go back home. The third continuing problem is, of course, of giving them some money, putting some money in their hands, because as reports show, they are not even being given work under this Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So they have no source of income. They've had to borrow money. In fact, the Supreme Court order this in the suo motu finally was that they shouldn't be charged any money. Before that, several high courts had passed the same orders. But the fact is that most of these migrant workers who have gone back home have had to pay their train fares, their bus fares, their truck. If they've hired a truck for their truck, etc., they have had to pay several thousand rupees each, for which they have had to sometimes borrow money. Their families have borrowed money and sent money to them in order for them to go back. And therefore, that is also a very, very serious problem. They desperately need some money to be put in their hands. So these are the issues which are still being discussed in this case, which is still ongoing. That's where we stand. So I'll stop here and I'll.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Prashant Bhushan. But one obvious question which is coming to my mind is that initially, as you yourself told us, that two petitions were dismissed by the Supreme Court. Then what was the, I mean, immediate need to, I mean, taking a suo motu action, whether this happens or whether any such thing has earlier happened that on the same thing, the Supreme Court is rejecting the petition, then on its own, it is taking up that petition. I mean, the same kind of petition.
No, I'm not aware of this kind of thing having
Mhm.
happened earlier. I don't think it has happened earlier. It's quite unprecedented. And it was obviously in response to the very, very severe criticism that they faced. In fact, in
Mhm.
one of the hearings, the Justice Sanjay Kaul told me, Mr. Bhushan, why have you come here in Jagdeep Chokhar's petition? You have no confidence in us, because I had said, written a tweet in which I
Mhm.
had that the collapse of the Supreme Court today is even more serious than the collapse of the Supreme Court during the emergency. Now, they were very hurt by this comment of mine. And
Mhm.
they said that, why do you come to us if you have no confidence in us? I said,
Mhm.
where do I go? That's my view, that this is
Mhm.
what I've done. And therefore, I have expressed my view. But what option do these people have? What do they do? And don't hold them hostage. Don't hold these poor migrant workers hostage to your anger against me. If you are angry with me, I will withdraw from the case and let some other lawyer handle this case. But don't make these migrant workers hostage to your anger against me. So
Mhm.
thereafter they issued notice, etc. But then again, after in the next hearing, they dismissed this petition, saying that the government is saying that nobody is on the street, everybody is fine, and therefore we dismiss it. So
Uh,
yeah, it was rather unprecedented.
Yeah, so there is a question which one participant with the name of Mukhyamantri has asked whether the Supreme Court can itself do the monitoring of this, because we have found that in many cases the Supreme Court itself monitors the case. So, what was the point in accepting whatever the government said? The Supreme Court itself would have gone into monitoring, or any such investigation would have been conducted by the Supreme Court itself.
Of course, they could have, and they should have, of
Yeah.
course. And they had no business to accept the government's version when the government's version was being contradicted by hundreds of very, very credible press reports and other reports prepared by very credible organizations like the Stranded Workers Action Network, the Azim Premji University. They had put out very detailed reports, totally contradicting what the government was saying.
Yeah. You also pointed out that almost 19 high courts took up such kind of matters related to migrant laborers, and then the other issues related to COVID-19, the testing and all. And the high courts kept on issuing some other orders. So, I mean, if the Supreme Court is not listening to a petition or rejecting a petition, on the other hand, on the similar lines, certain petitions are being accepted by the high court, and the high courts are issuing the order. So, I mean, how do you explain this kind of paradox?
Well, so the same thing happened during the emergency when the issue of whether a habeas corpus petition is maintainable during the emergency came up. 10 high courts held that yes, it is maintainable, but the Supreme Court held that it was not maintainable.
Hmm.
In many of these cases, the Supreme Court stayed the high court's orders.
Hmm.
So, for example, in that case of Delhi riots or that Gautam Navlakha, etc., High
Hmm.
Court, when it passed some good orders, they went to the Supreme Court and got the High Court order stayed. So uh, we have seen this pattern and this phenomenon even earlier. That you see, because in the High Court there are many more judges. In the Supreme Court there are only 30, 35 judges. In the High Courts there are several hundred judges. There are so many High Courts and there are so many judges in each High Court. So usually among them, there are some, at least a few, who are very independent and also very robust and bold. But as you go up to the Supreme Court, we find that the government keeps on obstructing the appointment of bold and independent judges. So in the Supreme Court, by and large, relatively, there are fewer bold and independent judges, and there are fewer judges in general. So this is one of the
Yeah. And and what would you say? I mean, there were some reports from Gujarat High Court because we all know that the conditions are very, very bad in Gujarat, though in media also that is not reported that way. We find a lot of mention about bad conditions due to COVID-19 in different states. But then Gujarat, there is very little news. And as I have read, there were reports that there's a three-judge bench of the Gujarat High Court which was passing orders repeatedly to the Gujarat government. And then this the composition of this bench was changed, and one of the judges was transferred from this bench. So, what will you say on such kind of attempts being made to subdue the voice of the High Court?
Yes, this is also a very unfortunate phenomenon. Uh, Unfortunately, see, one of the things that happens is that the Chief Justice, who is supposed to be the master of the roster, he decides which case is to be heard by which judge or which bench. And unfortunately, there's a pattern that we have seen that if the government is able to somehow influence and control the Chief Justice, they are able to influence the outcome of virtually every important case, because they can ensure that every important politically important case comes to be listed before a bench of the government's choice if the government can influence the Chief Justice. And this is something which we are seeing now even in the Supreme Court for many years. And that is why those four judges held a press conference about 2.5 years ago, four senior judges, complaining about how the Chief Justice was abusing his position as master of roster in order to list politically sensitive cases before benches which are convenient to the government, which has endangered democracy, they said.
So, don't you feel that this, I mean, if this is allowed to happen or this continues to happen, then where the common people will go and ultimately they will lose faith in judiciary, and then this will lead to the collapse of democracy in the country?
Yes, yes. Of course, if the judiciary collapses, then in any case, it virtually leads to the collapse of democracy in the country. Uh, but if the people lose confidence in the judiciary, they will stop going to the courts and they will start resorting to whatever law of the jungle,
Means, yeah,
to say,
yeah,
whatever
yeah,
other means.
means there, yeah.
Uh, so this is a serious problem, and today, yes, the Supreme Court's reputation is at an all-time low. I have never seen the Supreme Court being so reviled by the public in general, and their credibility being so low. I have been watching the Supreme Court for the last more than 40 years, and I have never seen the credibility of the Supreme Court and the judiciary in general as bad as it is today.
What are the powers in such case? Suppose, I mean, this pertaining to this migrant labor issue, if the Supreme Court is not listening to them and executive is also not doing the kind of justice which is expected of it to the benefit of the migrant workers. Now, what is the way out? Whether under the constitution, the president has some powers. As one of the participant of this session, Sumit Anand has raised the point. I'm not sure, so I'm asking to this, that there is a provision, there is an article in the constitution which is 123, which empowers the president to take action in such kind of scenario.
No, you see, the president normally acts only on the advice of the government. Hmm.
Yeah.
Uh, that's what the constitution says, that the president must act on the advice of the council of ministers. Uh, the president's freedom to act independently is very limited. He can send a bill back for reconsideration to the government once, but if the government reiterates, he has to sign it. He can, when the new government is to be formed, then the president decides who is to be called to form the government, uh, who is to be called first, and he's to be asked to prove his majority, etc. That's also an independent act of the president. But by and large, the president only acts on the advice of the government. It is really the judiciary which is independent of the government, can act independently of the government and of the legislature. And it is the judiciary's duty to ensure that the government remains within the bounds of their powers defined by the Constitution.
Since you talked about the erosion, I mean, as far as the trust of the people in judiciary is concerned, and you also talked about the system of the appointment of the judges, but I feel there are problems at two levels. One, at the point of the appointment of judges, and another is the post-retirement jobs, which normally judges are looking after, which is a more serious problem.
So both are very serious, but of course the appointment problem is more serious. See, earlier the judges were appointed by the government, and therefore it used to be said that in order to be appointed a judge, you don't need to know the law, you need to know the law minister. Thereafter, the judiciary took over the power of appointing judges to itself, and now there is a collegium of senior judges who decides. Of course, ultimately the government has to issue the notification. The government can also sit on a recommendation, which this government has been doing now. It sits on recommendations of the collegium for years altogether, and then it returns it. And even thereafter, even when it is reiterated by the collegium, even then it continues to sit, even though it has no right to sit on it. Under the law, they have to make that appointment. The government has been doing it. But there is a problem with the selections by the collegium also. The selections by the collegium are very arbitrary, non-transparent, nepotistic. And therefore now, instead of knowing the law minister, you need to know one of the members of the collegium in order to be appointed a judge, because there is a lot of nepotism in these appointments. So this is also a very serious problem, and because the appointments become dubious, so to say, therefore the whole lineup in the judiciary becomes dubious. The other issue of post-retirement jobs is also an important issue. We feel that post-retirement jobs should not be in the hands of the government at all, because that's one way of compromising the independence of judges. It should be in the hands of a totally independent Judicial Appointments Commission. In fact, appointment of judges should also be in the hands of a totally independent Judicial Appointments Commission, not an ex officio body like was proposed earlier, not a body of sitting judges and law minister, etc., but a body. It should be a full-time body of maybe some retired judges, some other eminent public figures who should do this job of selecting judges in a rational, scientific manner, in a transparent manner.
So this means, according to you, the attempt that was made to change the collegium system by bringing the National Judicial Appointment Commission, that was also not a right thing to do.
No, that would not have helped. In fact, that would have increased the government's influence in the appointment of judges. You see, one slightly positive thing that happened with the collegium system was that it made the appointments of judges slightly more independent of the government. Even though the government, this present government, has still been interfering by not appointing, by sitting on the recommendations. But even so, it was better than the previous system where the government used to select. So then, of course, if that was there today, then this government would have ensured that only their own people come to be appointed.
Yeah, one of the participants, Hardik Dogra, who is a student of journalism, he has pointed out that the problem of the migrant movement this time is much grave than what happened in 1947. Do you agree with this?
So in 1947, it was not migrants, it was not migrant workers, it was really refugees. It was inter-country migration, uh, largely on religious lines, etc. Uh, yeah, it is almost as serious as that migration. perhaps in some ways more serious, perhaps in some ways less serious. There were different kinds of migrations. But
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah. Do you feel that, whether it's a center's responsibility or the state's responsibility, because there have been a lot of such issues as when the lockdown started, all the decisions were taken by the central government, but in due course of time, state governments were also involved. And by the time this fourth lockdown came to an end, the central government said that it is all to the state government to take their own decisions. So, can you tell us, in the light of the constitution, that in the case of the migrant labor, it is actually whose responsibility primarily, the central government or the state government?
see, under the Disaster Management Act, the central government has been issuing these orders under the Disaster Management Act
Yeah.
regarding the lockdown and rules of the lockdown. And earlier they used to issue their own orders. They left nothing to the state governments. Now they've been leaving many things to the state government. Strictly speaking, and I wrote an article about this in the Hindu, strictly speaking, the Disaster Management Act does not apply to a virus caused disaster. For that, there are different acts. There is an Epidemic Diseases Act. Um, the uh, this kind of, you see, under the Epidemic Diseases Act, etc., any order to control the spread of that disease, that authority is with the state governments, with the states, not with the center. So, strictly speaking, that the center's powers under that act are only, in fact, under the lists also, public health is a state subject. So all measures to do with public health, all orders and executive decisions and legislation to do with public health have to be with the states, not with the center. Disaster Management Act, therefore, is not applicable to a COVID type of disaster. It's applicable to other kinds of disasters, but this is a subject which is reserved to the states under the Epidemic Diseases Act. And uh, so therefore, strictly speaking, the central government has no such authority. But so far as migrant workers are concerned, it is clearly the job of the central government to provide wages to them. It is not the obligation of the state governments, because they have declared this lockdown and they have the money. States have no money. States are totally starved of funds. All the money is with the central government. So therefore, that should be with the central government. That
And what,
obligation.
yeah, and what do you think about the role of the media, during this whole pandemic, and the kind of reports which have been appearing in newspaper? What are your views on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, most of the media in India has collapsed, and it is largely functioning as an instrument of the central government. Uh, they are completely under the control of the central government. And a lot of it is doing very, very harmful and hateful reporting in order to spread the narrative that the government wants to spread, that is of spreading communal hatred by using false news, fake news, etc. And that is why even this whole coronavirus thing was made out to be a communal thing, as if this is a Islamic conspiracy to spread the virus in India and so on. It's very, very unfortunate the role that the mainstream media has been playing. On the other hand, there are some internet media or media portals like The Wire, Scroll, News Laundry, News Click, etc. And many YouTube channels run by people like Dhruv Rathi, Akash Banerjee, etc., which have been doing a much, much better job of public information, public education about all this. But most of the mainstream media, except for few like Indian Express, Hindu, NDTV, etc., by and large, most of the mainstream media has just collapsed and is not fulfilling its role to inform and educate the people.
So, referring again to the legal aspect, as you referred to the Act, is Disaster Management Act, which was brought in the year 2005. And then if we again refer to the British Time Act, which was brought in 1897 against this pandemic or the Epidemic Diseases Act, don't you feel that the legislature in India and the government in India has failed to bring the right kind of law to deal with any pandemic or any epidemic kind of situation, and why no such law has been made?
Well, the Epidemic Diseases Act gives the powers to the state governments to deal with the spread of epidemic diseases. Of course, interstate spread uh, can be checked even by the uh, central government. Central government has those powers. But within a state, what should be done or not be done to check the spread of that disease, that should be left, and that should normally be left to the states, because like Kerala, for example, was doing great work in checking the growth of this the spread of this coronavirus. And yet the central government had been issuing them various directions and they had been protesting against that. We don't need to have this kind of a lockdown which you are suggesting. And ultimately, this is what we are finding, that lockdown was not of much use because the virus cases kept on increasing exponentially, still increasing exponentially. But uh, and now, despite that, they have had to relax the lockdown because of the devastation that it was causing.
So regarding the labor issues in general, I mean, these time, obviously the crisis is much more, but under the normal circumstances, also laborers or the workers, they face lots of problem, despite so many laws which you mentioned initially, which are in existence. So what do you feel, whether the laws are not enough to deal with this kind of situation, and there is a need to bring an amendment or an improvement in the laws related to workers?
No, there are enough and good labor laws which have been brought in from time to time. The Contract Labor Act, the Payment of Wages Act, the uh, Industrial Disputes Act, the Interstate Migrants Act, the Building and Construction Workers Act. Laws are there, but unfortunately, they are not being enforced. They are not being implemented. All the governments, whether they are the central government or the state government, by and large, are not implementing these acts. And
So,
therefore, they need to be taken to task, like the Supreme Court did in that Building and Construction Workers Act in 2018.
so, I mean, what kind of measures you suggest for making the laws more enforceable, more implementable? Can you suggest certain measures in this regard?
No, I can't suggest measures as such. I can only say that uh, see, when the governments themselves, from top down, from the prime minister onwards, they are not, or downwards, are not interested in implementing these laws. In fact, they have taken advantage of this COVID crisis in order to abolish all these labor laws. They were wanting to abolish one after another. States were passing, issuing notifications saying that for the next 6 months or for the next 3 years, these laws will not apply. Industrial Disputes Act, Payment of Wages Act, Contract Labor Act will not apply, etc. So they are not interested. They are calling for labor reform, so to say, which means that to abolish all regulation and protection of labor and leave everything to the market, so to say. So this government in particular is totally anti-labor, and therefore they don't want these laws to be enforced.
But what were the reasons why this problem reached at such a magnitude in India? Because COVID-19 has spread in almost the entire world and all the countries are affected. But the kind of problem that we witnessed in India, that was not seen in any other country. What is so peculiar about India?
No, in India, because of the poverty, you have a lot of migrant workers. As I said, there were 4 crores more than 4 crores according to the census of 2011. There are more than 4 crore construction workers. So it's a very, very huge number. And there are so many this huge crisis, which is what happened in India. There's no other country which has so many daily wagers and migrant workers who are so poor.
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Prashant Bhushan, to throw light on so many aspects of this migrant movement problem. And I am getting constantly messages after messages and questions and all, wherein everybody is congratulating you, saying thanks to you for expressing you so boldly, so vividly, and touching upon all aspects of this migrant issue problem. And before winding up, I should want to tell to all our listeners, particularly who keep on joining in all the webinars that we organizing. These webinars we are organizing for Delhi Metropolitan Education, which is a premier educational institution affiliated to Guru Gobind Singh Indraprastha University. And for the last more than 2 months, we have conducted many such webinars wherein very distinguished persons like you were there and who graced the sessions and who were kind enough to spare time and to give valuable knowledge and information to the participants. In DME, in fact, we run this media school and the law school. I represent a media school, and a lot of media students are there. We also run 2 law programs, BA LLB and BB LLB, which are the 5-year integrated law. And among the audience, we also have many law teachers and law students. Another important point which I want to tell you that this audience is pan India, and this shows that during this crisis time, everybody's hunger for knowledge has increased, and from 15 to 20 states people join in any such seminar that Delhi Metropolitan Education is organizing. So it's really a matter of contentment, matter of pride for us. So I thank you, Mr. Bhushan, and I thank you to all the participants of this session that they made this whole session very fruitful. And I hope that we will keep on organizing this and we all will be joining on this platform of webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you.